Recently, I had a video in my How Do I series called Mixing Drums Part 1 Using Gates. And in that video, I kind of blew right past my basic drum mixing setup. And since that video came out, I've had a couple people ask me, what did you do? It went by so fast, I couldn't catch it. So that's why I'm doing this video. And that's why it's called Mixing Drums Part 2, the prequel. Check it out. So the first thing I do is I go through each track, solo it up, just to kind of listen to what I got. See if there's anything weird, kind of get an idea of what the engineer did with the drums, what the overheads sound like, what the room mics sound like. Once I kind of get a grasp on that, I will go ahead and group all the drums into one auxiliary stereo return. And the reason I do this is even though I'm going to go through and treat each drum separately, at the end of the day, I've got to treat the whole drum kit as one big sound. It's one big instrument. So I can EQ and compress the drums all together, and plus it just makes it easier to turn them up and down and stuff like that. Oh, and don't forget to solo isolate your drum return. You can accomplish this by doing a command click on the solo button on the drum return track. It's very important to do that so when you're soloing up, say, the kick or the snare or whatever, you don't have to also solo the auxiliary return. The next thing I do is I just go through here and I set up a really basic rough mix. I try to not spend too much time doing this. I just want to work very instinctually. I don't want to get too analytical. I'm just going to go through, do a little basic level work here, a little panning. The next thing I'm going to do is go through here and listen to the instruments where I've got multiple mics on each drum. So you can see here, there's 3 mics on the kick drum. And I need to listen to these very carefully just to kind of get a grasp of which one's the best one, how I might make them work together. So I'm going to go through, solo these up. I'm going to do the same thing with the snare drum. I also need to check the phase on these things. So on this kick drum here, you see I got 3 mics. I'm going to pull up this EQ here. I just use this one because it's easy to get to and it's got a phase button on it. So I'm going to throw it on some of these tracks, flip the phase, see if it's better in phase, out of phase. Now, sometimes when I'm checking the phase, especially on something where I've got multiple mics on a single drum, I'll go in and I'll notice that it's not really totally in phase or out of phase. So sometimes I'll move a mic. If I've got an outside mic, like a mic away from a kick drum, or sometimes the under mic underneath a snare drum isn't quite where it should be, I'll move it. Just don't tell anybody I told you that. I'll also go and play the kit and I'll check the room mics and flip the phase on the room mics. See how that sounds. Am I getting more low end from the snare drum? Are the overheads, when I pop them on, are they sucking some low end out of the kick drum? And in certain situations, I will go ahead and maybe nudge the room mics around a little bit too, just a little bit to kind of get the phase just right. Once again, though, don't tell anybody I did that. It's kind of a secret. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do is start EQing some of these drums. I usually start with a kick drum, and I'm trying to get this, like, punchy section for the kick drum. And the way I do that is I like to play through my NS10s, and I feel like I can, when I get it at the right spot, it's almost like I can feel something in my chest, right? So I'm going to sweep around, look for that frequency. Let me just stop and add something here about the way that you're seeing me mix this song right now. This song I already mixed, so I'm going back and trying to recreate what I did. As I was mixing it, to be honest with you, I don't remember what order I did this stuff in. I'm trying to do it in some sort of structure that makes some sort of sense, like grouping EQs and stuff together. But I know when I mix, I'm not soloing up so much. I should probably do one of these videos where I'm just mixing from scratch. I do it in a very non-linear sort of way. And I don't know if it would make any sense. So I'm recreating this mix in a kind of linear way to hopefully make some sense. Did that make any sense? Anyway, so I'm going to go through. I'm going to do some EQing here. I like to get some snap on the kick drum. So I'm going to sweep around and find that frequency up in the top end. Usually it's somewhere between 3 and 4K, or I can get some snap. I like to use fairly narrow bandwidths on these types of EQs for the punch and the snap, because I don't want to cloud out the mix. I just want to find that real punchy area. So on the snare drum, I use this plugin called Metric Halo Channel Strip. This thing's pretty amazing. The EQs are very aggressive. It also does this compression. I'm using, if you can see right here, or very slow attack time. It's just kind of a weird compressor, but I like it. I've never heard a plugin that sounds like this thing, and I use it all the time. The next thing I needed to do was on the overheads. I noticed that the mics were slightly unbalanced. It was leaning to one side a little bit. So the first thing I did was do a multi-mono trim plugin on the overheads, and just to balance them out. Now, at this stage, there's still quite a bit of work to do, but I'm not going to go too deep into detail on all that stuff right now. This video would be way too long. But I am going to go ahead and play the video at high speed, not as high as last time, so some of you can actually see the EQ curves. I know people are always interested in that, so I'm just going to run that, and then I'll come back and talk about the next step. And now the next thing is to do the whole dual compression thing on the drums, which I do by creating a second stereo auxiliary return for the drums and putting a lot of compression on that and blending it with the first one. Now, I'd just like to stop right here and say that some people will say, well, but that's not what drums really sound like. And you know, my response is always, we're not making records necessarily for how things really sound as much as how we think they sound. I mean, just if you're gonna be like that about it, it's like you wouldn't give a singer a microphone, like you would mix the vocals where you couldn't hear them, because there's nobody in the world that could sing louder than a drum kit or a guitar amp. But yet, when we make records, we mic them and we turn them up, and we put fake echo and reverb and all of that on it. So like, you've already crossed a line there. So don't get all like, hey, that's unnatural. And the other thing is, I always hear people saying that, oh, compression squashes the sound and kills it. And I don't know what people are talking about when they say that, because I always use compression to open up sounds. Maybe it's because I tend to use faster release times. I don't know. I've just never experienced the problem with having compression kill anything. So anyway, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another stereo auxiliary return for the drums, and I'm going to put some really heavy compression and stuff on it. First off, what I'm actually going to do is put an EQ on it and roll off some low end, because there's some low stuff in the drums that'll just be affecting the compressor too much, and I actually don't want that in the compressed track. It would just do some weird stuff. I also am very careful to make sure that anything that I put on this compressed drum return, I have the same exact plugin on the regular drum return, with hardly any effects on it. If I'm going to have a compressor on it, to make sure it's not compressing, or maybe it's just compressing a teeny bit. So check it out. Here's what I do. Just get some crushed sounds here. And my whole thing with the drums, with the compressed drum return, is to just make them sound exciting. It's not really about the attack so much. I'm actually squashing the attack. The thing that you got to be careful about is if you let too much of the attack get through, you're going to, these little transients, they're going to your mix, especially when you get into mastering. I had that happen to me once. So make sure that you're, for this technique, kind of squashing the attack, and just make the drum sound kind of crazy and exciting. And then you're going to blend it in like this with the first drum return, and then suit to taste. I've sometimes actually done three drum returns, and on the third one I'm just doing some crazy stuff. But what the hell? It doesn't matter if it sounds real or not. It just matters if it sounds cool. That's the only thing that matters. Is it cool? Sometimes being cool and making it cool is doing something really hype. Sometimes doing something cool just means that you're hardly doing anything to the drums. One microphone or two microphones with hardly any effects on it, that can be cool too. It's all the context. It's all composition and what else is going on around the drums at the time. So I felt like I got the drums sounding pretty good, but the producer, Andrew Hill, had asked for a very specific type sound, and he had actually a reference for me. And going back and listening to that reference, I realized, the drums need to kind of like pop, almost like in this papery sort of way. And I decided, well, probably just need to add some samples to this. Now, I use samples, I add samples to drum kits quite frequently, but but I never replace actual drum sounds. I'm usually blending them in. So I'm not going to go deep into all that. I think everybody knows how these plugins work. I'm just going to show you what I did here. I use Trigger. I think that's one of the better ones out there. I'm not going to show you the samples I use because those actually are trade secrets. But I will say about some of the sample libraries that come with them. I've got my own. I've made my own samples. Some of the samples that come with these drum replacement plugins, they just sound too processed to me. Just too like in your face and almost too much attack. I almost always have to EQ some top end off of them. And often I got to put a little bit of a limiter on them to tame them down a little bit. On this particular song, the snare drum was a little uneven in the volume. So because of those things, I put a limiter on the snare drum sample. One of the most common things I do when putting samples on snare drums is actually using samples of a more room sound. I'm actually rarely using the close mic snare samples because a lot of the drums that I get from people are not recorded in big rooms, and I just need a bigger room. And when I get the right room sound, I often don't need to add much reverb, which is actually something I'm going to go over in another episode coming up, so come back for that one. And as you know, when you're adding samples to drums, you've got to go through every single drum hit and make sure they're lined up for phase. Otherwise, you're going to lose some low end on a particular hit or lose some impact. And that can really affect the vibe of the production, especially if it's on the downbeat of a chorus or something like that. So go through, check all of them. Another thing I did on this particular mix that I never really do, and that is that I added limiters to the drum returns. I still felt like some of the snare drums and some of the other drums were just popping out once in a while, so put a little bit of a limiter on each one of these. Not a whole lot, just a touch. All right, and that's about it for how I start setting up a drum mix. If you got any comments or questions, leave them below. Remember to subscribe. And in the next... sorry, Gigi came here to get involved. Now I forgot what I was going to say. I think the next video I'm going to do about drum reverb. So thank you. Have a good day. Talk to you later.